is that there are people out there that think you're John the Baptist, come back from the dead. Well, if you remember your New Testament history, John the Baptist was Jesus' cousin. John the Baptist is the one who introduced Jesus to his public ministry when he baptized him in the Jordan River. But then John the Baptist got himself in trouble with the king. He criticized Herod, and as a result of it, Herod literally had his head on a platter, and that was the end of John the Baptist. But John the Baptist, one thing Christians don't realize, stirred up an enormous amount of interest in Israel in the first century. In fact, the Jewish historian Josephus gives more ink, more space to John the Baptist than he did to Jesus. You ever wonder about why John was so famous? Remember the Jewish history. The Jewish people had a history of prophets, men that they believed were sent by God to speak to the nation. And you hear about the prophets in the Old Testament of Jeremiah and Isaiah and Ezekiel and Daniel and Hosea and Micah and Jonah and Amos and all of those folks. And sometimes when we compact all that Old Testament history, we get the idea or the impression that that God was speaking to these people behind every bush, and at every 5 minutes a prophet would come into town and give them their latest progress report from heaven. But that wasn't the case. Those who were so anointed of God to deliver God's message to the people were very, very special. And with Malachi, you remember the Old Testament ends with the book of Malachi. With the death of Malachi, the whole function of the prophet stopped cold in Israel. And for 400 years, there's not a prophet anywhere. Think about it. This is what, 1985. 400 years ago would have been 1585. Columbus hadn't even gotten here yet. Think of all the history that has transpired in the world in 400 years. But in Israel, for 400 years, not a peep out of God. Prophets are long gone. They're ancient history. And then all of a sudden, this guy comes out of the desert eating grasshoppers, and he's dressed like a wild man, and he's calling everybody down to the river to get baptized, and he appears as a prophet. Well, that really stirred everything up. He got the attention of the people. And there was all this activity surrounding John the Baptist, and interest in him. And so he became famous. Now, when his fame reaches its peak, Jesus is just starting. And so there are very few people who have heard yet about Jesus. And then John is suddenly killed. And rumblings are coming out of Galilee and Capernaum and Canaan of this other man who's coming preaching pretty much the same thing that John the Baptist was preaching. Only now, not just preaching to people like John the Baptist, but now the rumors are flying that he turned water into wine and that he raised somebody from the dead, and he's doing all of this miracles. And Herod himself, who was the one who ordered the execution of John the Baptist, when he heard these rumors, he said, "Oh no, that can only mean John the Baptist has come back to life." And so that rumor was running all over Palestine that John the Baptist had come back to life, that even the sword of Herod couldn't shut him up. But the people were confusing Jesus with John the Baptist. And so the disciples say, some people think you're John the Baptist. Other people, Jesus, say that you're Elijah. Have you ever been to a Jewish friend's home during the feast of Yom Kippur? Where you might sit around the table and they celebrate the Passover, not Yom Kippur, the Passover. When they're celebrating the Passover, and they have all of the special foods prepared to celebrate Passover, and you might come into the table and you see everyone seated around a table, and then at one end of the table there's an empty chair, and maybe you started to walk over and sit in that chair, and somebody grabbed you and say, no, you can't sit there. That place is reserved. Have you ever had that experience? Who's that chair for in the Jewish family? The chair is there for Elijah. Because the last prophet of the Old Testament, Malachi, in the very last page of the Old Testament, in the very last paragraph of the Old Testament, in the very last sentence of the Old Testament, the absolute last prophecy of the Old Testament from Malachi was this, that someday the Messiah is going to come, but before he comes, God is going to bring back the prophet Elijah. And so you can imagine if prophecy has ceased for 400 years, and then all of a sudden John the Baptist comes on the scene, and now Jesus, the people are all whipped up and they're all excited, and they're thinking, maybe it's time for the Messiah to come, and maybe this is Elijah. And so there were people in Jesus' day who thought Jesus was Elijah. And so they run this by Jeremiah, one of the other prophets. And what are they saying? They're saying, Jesus, they think you're pretty significant. They don't know who you are. But the rumors include John the Baptist from the dead, Elijah, Jeremiah, or some other great prophet. And Jesus says, that's interesting. Now here's the big question. Who do you say that I am? Now we've heard how the public is reacting. But you men are with me. You hear me. You watch me. You're on the inside of my ministry. My life is an open book to you. What's your judgment? Who do you say that I am? Well, it's Peter who answers for the group. And Peter says, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. Do you realize what Peter is saying here when he makes that statement? You are the Christ. Let's go to the board here for a minute and just write the name Christ.